Hi friends, and welcome to Raft. I was up too late one night and I had a question. How small of a raft could you make but still complete the game? First, let's define complete. Raft is still in development, so it doesn't really have a defined end at this point, but what it does have is several story locations. The requirements to get to any locations after the first one don't really change, so I opted to call the top of the first story location my endpoint, like most of the speedrun categories. So with that said, here are my rules for the run. 1. The raft must have the smallest possible footprint. 2. I must make it to the top of the radio tower. That's it. Sounds simple enough, so let's go. When you load a new world in Raft, you're given this lovely starting space of a 2x2 plank square to call home on this endless ocean. For us, it won't ever get bigger than this tiny square. Or so I thought when I started this. The beginning of the tiny raft run starts the same as a casual playthrough. Hook as many resources as possible and start building up your supply base. The first thing you need to make a substantial amount of progress is a research desk. It basically allows you to research materials, and that gives you recipes to make more advanced materials and items. It's pretty essential to get anything that you can't get from directly hooking out of the ocean. I need it if I have any hope of making it to the radio tower. I was just barely in the groove of researching materials when Jeremiah the shark was already causing problems. A quarter of my starting base was gone, but that doesn't change all too much. Through a bit of trial and error in testing worlds, when I came up with this idea, I learned that the smallest raft you can technically make is a 2x1. If either of those squares is destroyed by either the player or the shark, the entire raft disappears. There's no way to rebuild it, and it is fully game over. So while I wanted that 2x1 footprint eventually, I just needed to live for now. That required me building an extra square on my raft, but don't worry because I destroyed the other after getting everything situated. I was going to have to be careful if this raft had any chance of surviving. To get to the radio tower, you need a few special objects. You need a receiver, and you need antennae. Fortunately, the blueprints are pretty easy to come by. Unfortunately, they require a lot more of advanced materials to make. The biggest hurdle here is to get your hands on a smelter, which is required to make roughly a third of the materials necessary to build the receiver and antennae. The smelter requires 6 dry bricks, each of which require 2 sand and 2 clay to make. So I needed a total of 12 of each to make a smelter in addition to the many pieces of metal and copper ore that I would need to smelt. Sand, clay, metal ore, and copper ore can only be found in the water surrounding the islands that are randomly generated through the ocean, so I had a lot of diving to do. After a few dive trips, I still didn't really have much in the way of sand or clay. This meant getting to every island I saw as soon as possible was going to be the make or break condition for the Tiny Raft Challenge. But before I could even make it to one more island with my newly downsized raft, tragedy struck. I was headed to a giant island, a promised land of plentiful resources, hooking in items along the way. Jeremiah had other plans. The game requires you to pull your hook in all the way before you can switch items, and by the time I had made it to my spear, the plank was already gone. But shockingly, my raft remained. My tiny square loaded with all of my worldly possessions was still afloat. Life was looking up, or so I thought. I finally made it to the island, although I knew I had to be careful because my raft wasn't anchored and could therefore float away at a moment's notice. It was safely bouncing along the shoreline, so I felt safe enough standing on my little square while thinking of a plan B. While I was deep in thought, the raft simply floated through the ground. And it never came out. So I guess you can technically have one square, it's not meant to happen, and the game will hate you forever. So with the first run lost in the ground, it's time to reset and try again. Now that you're familiar with the basics of Raft's mechanics, we can skip to the good parts. Attempt 2 starts roughly the same as Attempt 1. Get materials, make a research table, and that was it. Before I even had time to research even the most basic materials, Jeremiah attacked the raft. I had no spear to defend myself and no time to make one. Just as quickly as it began, the attempt was over. I was left floating in the ocean with no way to continue. Yet again, it was time to begin anew. By now, I had plenty of experience in the early stages of the run. Attempt 3 appeared ridiculously lucky, with plenty of barrels and a conveniently placed island that my raft kindly got itself stuck on. I learned my lesson and made a wooden spear as soon as I had the resources. It was the perfect environment to start gathering sand and other resources without having to worry about my raft floating away, or simply disappearing into the island itself. I still wanted to keep my base raft for as long as possible, but I had a new purpose. Jeremiah's destruction of my previous attempt gave me an idea. I needed to get a smelter as fast as possible. Smelted metal bars can be used to fortify both foundation blocks and collection nets. Once fortified, the shark can't destroy any given base, so my raft would be invincible and I would be free to live my life without fear. That meant finding as many islands as I could, digging everything I could find, and getting my foundation armored as soon as I could. I was so focused on the underwater materials that I didn't even bother making an axe, and thus I continued to live on my 2x2 square from the beginning of the game. I just hopped from island to island, gathering sand and clay whenever they appeared, and moving on as soon as they were gone. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. I found another small island with plenty of clay and sand to go around, so I set to making bricks, which had to be laid on my foundation to air dry. I set about my way, thinking that this was it, things were going to go perfectly. And yet again, Jeremiah happened. All it took was me turning my back for a second, and there went my research table and hard-earned bricks. And with that devastating development, I decided I wasn't really happy with the direction this run was heading, so it was time to start over. Attempt 4 came with a new strategy. Raft allows for vertical building in addition to horizontal expansion. To relieve some of my space constraints, I could always go up rather than out. I'm still going to make the raft as small as possible in both directions, but this could allow for some new possibilities. To make things a bit more fair, I added 2 more rules. 3. I could not rebuild any of the base that Jeremiah destroyed, and 4, for that every square of the base that I built, one had to be destroyed. With these new rules, I couldn't let myself fall into the trap of just replacing broken things. Repairing is still allowed, but you've already seen how hard it is for me to keep my raft afloat in the first place. That said, the beginning of the attempt is the same as the others. Hook as many resources as I can, make a spear, make a research table, and start grinding for a smelter. Although the initial resources were nothing special, this run was going to be amazing. I could just feel it. As soon as I had enough resources, I immediately started work on the second story. Don't ask me why I chose to make everything out of solid wood when it's more expensive. It was definitely a mistake later on, but hey, at least it looks nice. From there, it was the same old routine. Gather materials and stop at any islands to grab sand or clay. My ladder kept giving me trouble, so I ended up replacing that one board that Jeremiah broke, but as promised, I destroyed one board in its place. After a close run-in with Jeremiah and an exceptionally lucky resource gathering session on an island, I finally learned the recipe to make a smelter. This was farther than I had ever gotten. Things were getting real. One small island later, I was down to just 2 boards after Jeremiah attacked and I once again had no means of defense. But I was so close to making my smelter and armoring my foundation, I wasn't just going to give up now. It was nearly game over when Jeremiah attacked again while I was organizing, but thankfully I was able to fend him off this time. I had the last brick I needed drying on the top floor, and I wasn't going to leave my raft again until it was fully protected. In the meantime, I built around my raft with some scaffolding blocks, so I could finally place in the collection net that would be my second block for the rest of the game. These blocks were solely to make sure that I didn't accidentally destroy the raft while placing the net, and were destroyed immediately after. Then it was finally time. I placed my smelter. Getting the metal bars and nails necessary to fortify my raft was just a waiting game. I was constantly wary of Jeremiah's presence, knowing that this could go wrong at any moment. And just like that, I could fortify my base. Jeremiah no longer posed a threat to my raft's existence. Now I just had to build the receiver and antenna, and I could finally make my way to the radio tower. I expanded the top floor to give myself a bit more room, and continued to gather materials I needed for a while before discovering something I had never seen before. In addition to the multiple story locations in Raft, there are 2 kinds of rare islands that have a random chance to spawn. While on my tiny raft, I stumbled into a shipwreck island. These things only have a 2% chance of spawning while a small island is rendered, so they're pretty hard to come across. It also had this nifty captain's hat, which I will definitely be wearing. More amazingly, after a bit more research gathering, I came across something else. A plane crash island, which also has a 2% chance of spawning. This one had a pilot's hat, but I like my sailor's hat better. There are literally only 2 kinds of these special islands in the game, and I miraculously found both of them before even reaching the first story location. I told you this run was lucky. Besides those cool islands, most of my time was just spent collecting all of the copper and metal I would need to make the receiver and antenna. I finally had everything, so I started to place things down. And here is where I made 2 critical mistakes. The first was my failure to realize that I needed 3 antennae to make the receiver functional. Although it was a massive letdown when I thought I was so close to actually completing the challenge, it could be solved by some more grinding, which was easy enough. The second critical mistake was my failure to realize that the antennae needed to have at least 3 spaces between the antennae themselves and the receiver to function. That meant that my tiny raft was actually too small to function. I have 2 options: expand the base of my raft out to the distance required by the antenna, or build another floor. I chose the second and started building another floor, mostly because that way the bottom of the raft was still the smallest possible area, and I had struggled so much to get the base of my raft that small. So let's just amend the first rule a little bit. With another floor on my raft, the receiver and antennae placed the appropriate distance apart, and my sail fully deployed, I checked on my status. I was just 1,500 meters away from the radio tower, and the winds were in my favor. Now it was just a waiting game. At long last, the radio tower began to emerge on the horizon, a long-lost friend on the never-ending ocean. A bit of parkour later, I had done it. I reached the top of the radio tower. It may have taken me 4 attempts and over 10 hours of straight playtime, but I've finally done it. I've reached the top of the radio tower with only 2 planks between me and the endless abyss of an ocean that coats this planet. Maybe it didn't go the way I wanted, but I definitely learned some things along the way. Like that you can have one square, and the world will eat it. Go ahead and try this for yourself. See if you can get here too. It took me long enough. So if you've enjoyed, please leave a like, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. I'd love to know any crazy ideas you have, or anything you think I should have done differently. And as always, have a great day.